So then, we are back with more understandings from the time of the Second Tabernacle services, where we find in the Aramaic English translation of the word. This translation comes from the original manuscripts of the prophets of the Israelic lineage. So then we can understand the time of the end as per Yeshayahu the prophet. We find a layer of understanding of the spring feast, the autumn feast, and also the returning of the cities of the Messiah laid waste for many centuries. As we read then Yeshayahu, mostly chapter 1:8, you find then the cities returning. What are these cities? Very simply then, what then Moshe, known as Moses for some reason, has received then from the Creator himself in the desert, and then they started a holy city of their very own. This city on a desert then became the model as his people should then act and then practice until the coming of the Messiah. Then there was a substitution from the Creator himself, gave then the position for his son, and then would continue on around the world based from the first. So then, what can we understand of this section? Hebrews 7 speaks of the salvation granted on behalf of the Gentiles. Firstly then, let's understand the instructions were never abolished. They were completed. Unfortunately, the English word for completion is not the same as change. If you then read from Hebrews chapter 7 and verse 12, you find then, but as there is a change in a priestly line, this means obviously, if you read Chronicles for instance, you find then the priestly line, sections of it. But as there is a change in the priestly line, so also is there a change in the instruction. It's truly not a change. This word in Hebrew is directly related with then the second tabernacle service is related with the second menorah. It is a transition from the first then the second. So let's understand this layer very precisely. There is then a completion then for the second tabernacle services. This is where salvation comes from. The Messiah obviously gave his life, the Savior did complete the spring feast, and he then spent a whole year with his people teaching them precisely what they should learn. So then his 1,000 years would then obviously be completed. As he came and he completed the spring feast, so then he wanted his 1,000 years being completed as per instructions. Thus then you understand why he spent 12 months with his people. Some of these understandings are so obvious. So then, chapter 7 verse 12. But as there is a change in the priestly line, why should have then a change in the priestly line? Because they are no longer involved with holocausts or then sacrifices or oblations. They are no longer involved with the sanguinary practices. Though back then was important, then when the Messiah came, he completed this section, so then a second would then start. That's why we have Hebrews, because the changes of the instructions are then in Hebrews. Then there is another section related with it, very important. obviously speaking of the covenant. And there are people, for some reason, they become over religious with this situation. As was explained in yesterday, Gog and Magog are then visiting once again. They are trying to create more trouble of some sort. But as we read these understandings, you find then Israel, the United States are trying then to come up with some sort of a plan. But the situation is the gradual retrieving of the forces of the U.S. and the building of the first tabernacling on the land of Cush as per the instructions of the prophet makes it imperative. U.S. obviously must be rebuilt, and then there is a set time. The involvement with the U.S. must then wane, and people once again must become then online traders, so then they can resume normal way of living, because the world truly is in shambles. As we read then the 10th chapter, first verse, for in the instructions there are shadow prophetic events coming, not the substance of the feasts. What does it mean? It's precisely related with Leviticus the 23rd chapter. As you divide then the year related with the feasts, every year then the nation of Israel back then were involved with the holy feasts directly related with Leviticus. Then they were training, they were disciplining themselves, training for the coming of the Savior. Thus they did for more than 1,000 years. When we read then Hebrews, you are reading a completion of a period of time. Now, if you are from religions where then you don't observe these generational events, then there is no reason for having a Savior. Because completion is not the same as change. Then 10th chapter, 9th verse B. Behold, then the Messiah comes to do then the objectives of Elohim. Why does he say Elohim? Because it's a multi-spirit of the Creator. 7 spirits of Elohim, 7 functions. What's so known in some of these organizations, you find all the gifts of the Spirit. There are no gifts of the Spirit. What you find are functions, and those are related with the lineage. Gentiles, they don't function. Hereby he then completed the former, that he might establish then the second. Reading the instructions as then a person saved, you can either read the instructions as a manipulator to try to fit the instructions based from your own desires, or you read the instructions and you make the proper changes in each. either him or her, and then making the proper changes. The Messiah is obviously in a Holy of Holies. These understandings then, coming from Yohanan, gives you then what the priests of the Messiah should be doing. The core of this understanding simply means those regulations related sanguinary practices were already completed. They are related with the second. That's the second menorah. You have the first presence and the second presence. Then, as we read, explains very simply, for by these then they are sanctified. Does not mean they are saints. When speaking of the Gentiles, they are outside of the holy cities. They are the testifiers on behalf of the Savior. However, when you read Hebrews, this is what they do in the holy cities. Does it not say Hebrews? If they were speaking of Gentiles, would it be then the writings of the Gentiles? You are reading Hebrews because are for Hebrews. But then the false Messiah, depicted very straightforward on Revelation or Galah, you find then the scoundrel leading on a white horse. And then people have the wrong understanding. Then the Messiah is leading famine. Can you believe this? The Messiah himself is leading famine, death, destruction of many kinds. Yet the Messiah said himself he came to complete the instructions. Do you find destruction in the instructions? Did not the Creator himself said, if a person then is in sin, then he turns over to the enemy? If he does so, how can his son then lead in death? And then on a horse, the very symbol of power that should never be then used. Did he not say to hamstring those animals? But then the scoundrel on the first horse obviously is posing as the Savior. And some people, when they read Revelation, oh, that's the Savior. Now their own Savior. The Savior they concocted for themselves. As precisely then Shaliach Shaul has mentioned in 2 Corinthians 11:4. It's a Messiah outside of the parameters given by Moses. As we read these instructions, then you begin your quest of understanding. How can you understand so much of these times and the seasons? It's not truly what you can understand. is how you position yourself so the revelations can reach you. These understandings are given. They are not earned. But then if you don't take the time to study them, and when you study you want a section of instructions abolished for your own pleasures, then obviously you want a Messiah or Savior then abolishes any kind of instruction. And then the tendency of the person then is becoming self-religious. And then they idolize families. Scoundrels. Detestable. As then the Messiah completed his spring feast, he was very acquainted with the prophets, because the prophets spoke of him. Now let me ask you this. Why can't you find a section of what the Messiah himself said? After he completed the spring feast, then people would not have to observe any of the instructions. You don't find it. Then comes a section of the 11th chapter, known as the faith chapter, the junkie of the junkiest. What this chapter relates is with a path. Now reading how ridiculous is the regular translation, because faith, nobody knows what truly is. If you have a set path in front of you, why would you have to have faith? Simply do what the Savior did. He studied the prophets, he made then the path. Now faith is the persuasion of the things that is then hoped for, and if they were in actual fact, then the manifestations of the things not observed. What a stupidity. Never heard such a junk statement in my entire life. Now the understanding is, speaks of then Elohim, very important, speaks then later of Ibrahim, very important, speaks then of Sarah, very important. She was always obedient, she never rose her voice. There were no contentions in a tent. Then, reading from this chapter, what do we have? A person who believed what then the Creator has said. So what's going on then as far as Gog and Magog? Very simple. we've read yesterday as far as the covenant and then the covenant. You find a distinction of both covenants. There is then the covenant with Abraham. Then you find then obviously later Moshe or Moses receiving the instructions. Then when we read the 11th chapter of Daniel, you find then what Israel wants the most, building the third temple. However, the Messiah already said there won't be a third temple. When he was speaking of the temple built during the time prior of himself, when he said, not a stone is going to be left upon another, what went on? There he was, the Messiah, then teaching and explaining those areas. And because it is related with the future, what period of time is it? Is it during the spring feast or after? It's after. So there he was, spending his 12 months with his people. Then he was teaching, showing them precisely what went on with the instructions. And then they wanted to make him some sort of a king. Then he began his explanation of the future. Now, try to understand a fact. If the Messiah was sharing of the destruction of the temple during the time of the spring feast, they would throw him in jail. They would have. And the Messiah wasn't stupid. He knew how far then he should have gone with his words. When he was explaining of the temple, and then if they will destroy the temple, then he would rebuild in the third day, has nothing to do with it. They have absolutely twisted the whole understanding. Was the Messiah then going to destroy practices set by Moses? No. He did understand that the temple was then a human desire from David. The temple was never mandated. What was mandated was the tabernacle in a desert. A tent, and then precisely as they were told. The Messiah would never jeopardize his own ministry by speaking more than the mouth could handle it. So when he spoke of the temple, he was speaking of the second tabernacle services. He was speaking of a completion of. It's not if you destroy these. It's when you complete these. However, the human interference, because of the building, would then be destroyed. But he's not speaking then of his own body. The Messiah wouldn't have wasted his time speaking with the hard-headed scoundrels. The Messiah sometimes was very short. But going so far in destroying his own body in the midst of scoundrels, for what reason? Let's then understand why he was so many times involved with the people and then giving parables for. The parables were spoken in such a way so then people would filter themselves. Now, speaking of his own, what was he saying? He was speaking precisely what we then read from Hebrews. Completion of the first, so then they would practice the second. However, the Messiah said, as far as your building, this den of thieves then you have then built, not a stone is going to be left upon another. He was speaking of the building. He was not speaking of his own body. Why he would then, in quote, poke the lion with a short stick for? And then why would he reveal that he would then spend 72 hours then in inferno for? What would those people care? The Messiah was then concerned with those people who are enlightened. But then he himself trying then to convince of himself in the midst of scoundrels. Then there he was. During the time of his 12 months, he was there on the top of the mountain teaching and precisely showing his people what they should be doing. And they, from the Messiah, those who were listening to him, they felt the kingdom coming. But the Messiah was not speaking of the kingdom. He was teaching regarding his 1,000 years yet. It is kingdom related, but it's not truly the kingdom. Then they wanted to know then who's going to be the greatest, and then they could make him king of the entire situation. He was not interested. Because he spoke of the future, gives you then what period he was at. There was a section of the instruction related, is then Elohim restoring then the kingdom to Israel. This was during the spring feast. What did he say? It's not for you to know the times and the season at this point. That's the distinction from spring feast and post-spring feast. He was directing them so they would be involved with the objective of completing then the 1,000 years. He was teaching the second from the former. That's what we read then in Hebrews. Then the 11th chapter, however, warns us of Gog and Magog of the restoration period. Precisely as Israel trying to restore the temple, they have the Levitical priests involved with many kinds of rituals, and it truly is an abomination. The instructions of Moshe were already completed. Insisting with practices already completed becomes abomination and truly destroys. Thus the abomination that makes desolate. 11th chapter of Daniel. But then you find that during the time of the restoration period, you find then the holy city of the Messiah then restored on the land of Cush. Then you find the relationship of the holy city and the rest of the world. Then you find the nations linked up with the holy city and later the holy cities, as the 7 cities in Asia Minor must be restored. Then the country is prospering because of it, as it was during the time of Daniel, and the system then practiced for 1,000 years. Then came 1,000 years of deceit, and then we are returning. Then you find the covenant of the second. Then Daniel the 11th chapter speaks of the covenant of the first. Then you find Israel sending representatives of the covenant of the first. That's why Gog and Magog. Then United States and Israel trying to come up with some sort of mid-ground. And then later, because of prosperity as a result of the second, then the representatives of the first, Israel disobedient, misleading the people. So then, as Israel is further away from the holy instructions, and the more US is trying to extend their dominion, the worse it gets. What should Israel be doing? They should wait. What the US should be doing? Gradual retrieving for rebuilding. Neither of them wants to do it. Thus then Israel in the United States, Gog and Magog. Both scoundrels. From the enlightenment of what should be, and they forcing themselves, then you find Israel misleading the people via the first covenant, and then you find the despised one being United States. So then when the people read the instructions, they can understand the simplicity. It's very simple. Then Daniel was involved with a period of time where then was taking a while for him gather up the information and the system. The system of Daniel was adopted widely. During his time, then the nations around where Daniel was at, the Middle East, Asia, many areas of the world were adopting the system of Daniel. When the Messiah came, he completed the spring feast, spent 12 months with his people, then he taught them of how he wanted his 1,000 years to be played out. And as a result of the obediences of the nations regarding then the directives given by the holy cities, then the system of Daniel was adopted. Then came the 1,000 years of deceit, no holy cities, until 2009. Then we are returning of what it was. The system used during the time of Daniel, during the 1,000 years of the Messiah, and then during our time. As the trade was back then, during the time of Daniel, so it was during the time of the Messiah, so should be during our time. But this time is computerized. Then we understand why the Messiah was always pointing the people, so then the path was then formed. These we must study more in the future, because there is a direct link with then salvation from the second tabernacle services and the byproduct of these. Prosperity simply means situations lined up. It's not regarding the money. It's not what you do so then you acquire pieces of colored paper. You're speaking of principles. The path for life. And the Messiah said only a few are going to find it. The great majority, they want the colored piece of paper. Because they regard the instructions as abolished. When they do this, they are abolishing themselves. So the only thing left is then the colored piece of paper. So then, each of us must make a decision. Either we want rest after this life is gone, or torment. The choice is given, and then the next time I'm going to study more of tabernacling and study some of the situations going on with the nations, and then lining up other countries, because many nations are in trouble and they simply don't know what to do. They think they know, but they want to extend the 1,000 years of deceit, and they won't play what they want anymore. Please stay tuned, much more coming up.